Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady. I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled 6 Common Traps to Avoid When Collaborating on Requirements. Today's featured speaker is Karl Wiegers, and we also have Derwin Harris and Stephanie Bridges from Jama software. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session, so make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to Jama Software for sponsoring this event, and at this time I'm going to turn it over to Karl to get us started.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome everybody. Greetings from Portland, Oregon. I'm going to start this morning, or well, it's morning here. I don't know where it is, what time it is where you are, but I'd like to start with a short survey. I'm going to ask you about several experiences that you might have had on software projects that maybe didn't go exactly as you would hope. Think back to your most recent project. If any of these things have happened to you, give yourself a check mark for each one. So on that project, did you find that your customers felt they were too busy to spend time working with their business analysts or developers on understanding the requirements? If that happened to you, give yourself a little check mark. Did you find that surrogates for the users, who weren't the actual users, they tried to speak on behalf of the users to present requirements, but they really didn't do a very good job of doing that? If that was a problem, you get another check mark. Did you find that your developers encountered a lot of ambiguities and missing information when they were trying to actually write some software, so they had to make a lot of guesses, some of which were right, maybe some of which weren't so right? Did at some point your customers sign off, whatever that means in your environment, on the requirements, and then they changed them continuously so that sign-off really didn't mean much of anything at all? Did you find that the project scope kept increasing as requirements changed and grew and new ones came in, but you had trouble meeting the schedule because you didn't get anybody else to work on them and nothing else changed to accommodate that expansion? That's worth another check mark. Do you have trouble keeping track of requirements change status? You don't really know what the status of any particular change request is at any given time, and maybe some requests get lost and never get addressed, so you generally have a little chaos around the change process. Did that happen to you? If so, another check mark. And finally, when you got to the end of the project, did you find that the specification might have been satisfied, but for some reason the customer was not satisfied? So these are very common problems, and count up how many check marks you gave yourself. It should be an integer between 0 and 7 inclusive. People get very fussy with me if I'm not precise in my own requirements. I've done this little survey with lots of audiences, and you know, it tends to skew towards the higher end of many people having experienced these things. So the bad news is that these kinds of unfortunate things happen to everybody on software projects from time to time. But the good news is also that these kinds of unfortunate things happen to everybody, and that shared experience means that we can look for common techniques to try to prevent or correct these very common problems. So in this presentation, I'm going to describe 6 traps people often encounter when they're collaborating on requirements on a software project. For each trap, I'll describe several symptoms that suggest you might be getting caught in that trap or perhaps are already caught. I'll describe then several possible solutions, ways to avoid getting caught in the trap if you see it coming, or ways to extricate yourself if you're already experiencing some of those problems. Now, situations, projects, and cultures are all different, so there's no guarantee that all of the solutions I suggest will work for you. However, I have seen them give better results on many projects, and I suspect they'll give you better results as well. So the first trap I want to talk about is having inadequate stakeholder involvement. And here are some of the symptoms you might look for that give you a clue that maybe you're getting caught in this trap. Do you have certain classes of users, certain groups or user communities who you haven't really noticed? You haven't thought about their participation in the requirements process. Maybe we didn't even think of their existence, and so when you get down to having them try to use the software, they don't feel their needs were met, and they're not very happy about it. Or maybe you've identified certain user classes, but they don't have a voice. There's nobody who's the literal voice of the user or voice of the customer giving you input on behalf of that particular group. If not, then there's a good chance that you're going to have trouble meeting their needs. And in fact, you're just going to be lucky if you meet their needs. Very often we have people who are not actual representatives of a user community who attempt to speak on their behalf. And sometimes this is almost essential. In corporate environments, sometimes the managers of users try to say, well, I did that job for 5 years. I can tell you everything you need to know, so you don't need to talk to any actual users. And sometimes those people really are not totally in touch with what users are going to be doing today. And so you get a little bit of a disconnect. Now, in a commercial software environment, you often don't actually have good ways to interact with real users, although maybe there's more ways than you think. So you might have marketing people or product management attempt to try to get into the users' heads and think, well, what would our customers want? What kind of features would they find valuable? And probably the worst case is a developer who says, oh, if I was a user, here's what I'd want. Sometimes that works, but a lot of times it's not exactly on target. If you find that the developers are making a lot of the decisions about requirements, that's a very strong indicator that you don't have adequate involvement from actual users, customers, and other kinds of stakeholders. And so that's an opportunity to see if you can try to do a little bit better job at getting customers engaged. And the time you don't want to find out about this inadequate stakeholder issue is when it's really too late. And I saw a very good but sad example of this at a client site once I was visiting. The developers told me a story about how they had created a product for internal use in this company in good faith, but they had negligible customer input from the very beginning. The developers thought they knew what to build, so they went off and built it. And they unveiled their new system to the users, and the users immediately rejected it as completely unacceptable. Now, the day that you reveal your new baby to the world, you do not want to have people tell you your baby is ugly. But that's exactly what happened. So that's pretty discouraging, and it came as quite a shock. So what did they do? They fixed it. Isn't this astonishing? People feel in software, and this has always baffled me, we feel like we never have time to do things right. We never have time to get customers engaged and talk to the right people and record the information in the right ways. And yet we always somehow seem to find the time to fix the problems that result from those approaches. So we find the people, we find the time, we find the money, and that means other things have to wait and maybe don't get done. So this baffles me, but it's a very common kind of thing. So if these symptoms are things that you see happening in your current project, maybe there's an opportunity to do something about it. So here are some possible solutions to help with this trap of inadequate stakeholder involvement. Let's begin by casting a wide net to try to identify potential classes of users whose needs we may have to understand and try to accommodate. And then we need to find someone who can speak for those. And an approach that I have found for well, over 25 years now that works very well is to identify people we call product champions to serve as actual user representatives. Now, ideally, these will be people who are true members of the user class. Sometimes, as I mentioned, that's not as easy to do, but it's very important that you have a clearly identified person or small group of people to serve as user representatives and to be duly empowered and authorized to make decisions at the user requirements level on behalf of particular communities of users. Now, if you are in a commercial environment, you might not take that approach. You might instead rely on focus groups. Focus groups are representative groups of customers who are good for brainstorming and maybe looking at prototypes or providing feedback on specific questions, but generally they don't generate massive numbers of ideas, and often they don't have any decision-making authority, whereas product champions definitely do have the authority to make decisions about user requirements. But the focus groups are a good way to try to get contact points with customers. Very important for every project to identify early on who are the requirements decision makers. I don't think we always do this, but millions of decisions come up on any sizable project regarding requirements, and we need to know who are the right people to evaluate and make those decisions. And in addition, what is their decision rule? Anytime you have a group of people who are making decisions, they should spend a little bit of time early on talking about, so how do we make decisions? Do we vote and it has to be unanimous? Or do we vote and majority rules? Or do we reach consensus? Those are all different kinds of approaches. Do we delegate decisions to certain individuals? Can somebody override those decisions? So choose your decision rule wisely. You want to have ways to have contact point with various stakeholders. Now, I should mention that users are a subset of customers. That is, not all customers are users. And customers are a subset of stakeholders. So again, cast a wide net to identify all the potential stakeholders, people who could influence the project, or people who are participating in the project, or people who are affected by the project. So if you can identify specific users, let's have them get a little personal in contact with the system as it's undergoing exploration and requirements and development. Have them evaluate prototypes. Have them review requirements as we go along to try to see to the best of our ability if we've accurately captured the needs that, if satisfied, will enable us to achieve the business objectives that led us to launch the project in the first place. Now, there's another common trap, a vague and ambiguous requirement. And the most obvious sign of that is that people read a particular requirement and they interpret it in different ways. Actually, I think of two kinds of ambiguity. One kind I can spot myself, and that's when I look at a requirement and I say, it could mean this, it could mean that. I'm not sure which is correct. So maybe I can't resolve the ambiguity, but at least I detected it. But if you pass out requirements to several people, maybe a tester, a customer, a project manager, and a developer, and another BA, and they look at it and they say, this requirement means something different to each of us. Well, then you've got a problem. If you find that requirements are missing information developers need, then that's going to lead to problems because developers are going to have to close those gaps somehow. Sometimes you'll find that the requirements are not verifiable. And so this is one reason I love to have testers review requirements, because they're very good at looking at a requirement and saying, I can't tell any way to judge whether this requirement was correctly implemented. So let's learn about those, because that almost always indicates problems with the way the requirements are written. If you find developers are asking a lot of questions, you've given them some requirements in whatever form you're accustomed to, and you think they're good to go, at least for the moment, on the next round of development, and they keep coming up with questions, then maybe we're not doing as good a job as we thought we were on writing requirements, and this, again, might lead them to have to make a lot of guesses. Now, vague and ambiguous requirements are particularly a risk if you're doing outsourced development, or even if you're just doing multi-site development. There's distributed teams. You should never expect that even the best written requirements are going to replace human conversations. But with outsourcing, you have fewer opportunities for the day-to-day conversations that work so well to clarify requirements on a just-in-time kind of basis. As a result, people zig when they should have zagged, and you end up having to do a lot of expensive rework. So check to see if any of these things are happening in your world. If they are, maybe try these approaches. I'm a big fan of peer reviews, have been for many years, and in particularly I'm a big fan of inspection. Inspection is a type of formal, well-structured peer review that is particularly suitable for requirements documents, where you look very carefully with a group of trained people to try to find potential problems with the requirements. It costs so much more to fix an error in requirements late in the project rather than at the requirement stage, no matter what life cycle you're following. So let's try to find as many of those problems as early on as we can. I love starting the testing process pretty much right after you've written your first requirement. That's when you can start testing. You can start thinking of conceptual tests that you would use to judge whether a requirement was correctly implemented. So this is a way to verify your requirements. Now, this is not wasted effort. Sometimes people say, well, wait a minute, if we're doing all that testing thinking up then, don't we just have to do it all again later on? No, you're just reallocating effort throughout the project time or the iteration duration. Let's think about these tests just on a conceptual basis, by which I mean they're independent of how you might actually implement the software or perform the test procedure. But you can then compare your tests against the requirements, and you can find places where thinking about it from a what do I build point of view doesn't exactly match what you came up with thinking about it from a how do I try to break this point of view. They're two different thought processes, and preferably done in two entirely separate brains. And then you can compare those, and I guarantee you will find errors in your requirements, and you'll probably find errors in your tests as well. A lot of times when people talk about writing requirements, they think of a traditional natural language specification in some form. And natural language is very prone to vague and ambiguous kinds of presentations. So I prefer to think of writing requirements. I really translate that phrase to mean representing requirements knowledge. And by that I mean thinking of a diversity of ways in which you might choose to represent something you know about the requirements. Certainly natural language text is one, but also you might draw pictures called analysis models. And there's a whole lot of these that are useful, things like data flow diagrams and decision tables and entity relationship diagrams and feature trees, and just a lot of different kinds of pictures that can help you find gaps and errors and incompleteness in your requirements, and in places where over here it says do this and over there it says do something else. So I'm a huge fan of modeling as a way to represent requirements knowledge at different levels of abstraction. Sometimes you drill down, sometimes you step back. Very powerful technique. You might find creating prototypes to be worthwhile. There's a lot of different sorts of prototypes that you can make. And these are a way to help bring your requirements to life, make them a little more tangible. It's a lot easier for people to critique something that's more like what they're used to interacting with than to read pages of requirements and try to imagine what's there. Plus, one of the biggest problems with requirements is missing requirements. You find it's very hard to detect missing requirements by reading a specification because you don't see the one that's not there. That's pretty hard to catch. So prototypes help make it more real. Sometimes we have terminology problems that lead to ambiguity. And so creating a glossary is a good way to do that. And a glossary, incidentally, is a reusable asset across multiple projects, multiple parts of your enterprise. So I think you might consider building a nice comprehensive glossary of terms so people can reach common understandings. And there's a whole list of words that are just intrinsically subjective and ambiguous that I really don't like to see used in requirements documents at all. I've shown a few of them here. Minimize, maximize, optimize. I don't know how to tell if I've made something as big as it can be or as small as it can be or as good as it can be. It's very hard to judge those kinds of things. Very often people will be talking about software and say, oh, this has to be really fast or it has to be user-friendly or intuitive. And those are all good ideas, but they're terrible words to put into requirements because they're totally subjective. And so those should lead to conversations that say things like, okay, user-friendly. Well, what does user-friendly mean to you, Mr. Customer? How would you judge if something was user-friendly enough? Can you give me some examples of things that you think are and are not user-friendly so I can kind of get into your head? So don't write these words down in requirements, but use them as a starting point for conversations. Improved in exactly what part of the system, compared to what benchmark, by how much, measured how. These things are important. Several, or few, or lots. Those are really vague terms. If you ask 10 people what several meant, you'll probably get 20 different answers. I was teaching a class once, and I have this little exercise that has some requirements with various problems, and one of them is the word several. And most people catch on that as being ambiguous, but there was this one developer in the class once, and he said, no, he did not think that was ambiguous. He interpreted several to mean up to and including 100, which I think is clearly into the realm of many at that point. So several and few, those are not good words to include. And/or, hey, make up your mind, etc. Okay, the system shall process characters A, B, C, etc. Do you think we all agree on exactly where that list ends? Probably not. Include or including, even better, including but not limited to. Watch out for that. And I don't like to see the word support used in requirements unless you are building a bridge, because otherwise it is just too vague. All right, so those might help you get a little bit away from this trap of vague and ambiguous requirements. The third trap is analysis paralysis. This is perhaps more of a fear than it is an actual occurrence, but it's something that people can certainly get caught up into. And a sign of that is that the requirements activities on your project just seem to go on forever. Nobody ever gets to the point where they feel like, okay, yeah, we understand this well enough now. And you might find new versions of the requirements being released over and over until eventually your version numbers start looking like IP addresses. And that becomes very chaotic and confusing. People are never really sure just what they're dealing with. Maybe you never baseline the requirements. You never reach the point where you have a set of requirements, whether that is for the next iteration with 1% of your product or whether it's for the entire 100% of the product. But you never get to the point where you have a set of requirements that you can baseline and say, this is the next chunk of stuff we're going to build. Let's agree on that and move forward. So if you have trouble reaching that sort of agreement, then maybe you're caught in this trap. Maybe you find people are spending a lot of their time doing what used to be called mousing around, drawing lots and lots of models and representing them lots of ways just to make sure you haven't missed anything. And people have this philosophy that we can't really start with our design and coding until our set of requirements is perfect. Well, I have bad news. You are never going to get perfect requirements. It's a wonderful idea, but it's just not going to happen. So from a practical point of view, your goal is to get requirements that are good enough to allow design and construction to proceed at an acceptable level of risk. And the risk that we're concerned about is the need to have to do a bunch of unplanned rework to fix the problems. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish. So some possible solutions to this trap of analysis paralysis is to first of all keep in mind your product is software or something that contains software. Your product is not a requirement specification. People do not succeed in business because they have a perfect requirement spec. They succeed by building high-quality products based on a high-quality set of requirements. But they're not going to be perfect. So you need to choose an appropriate development life cycle. On some projects, you have the ability to reach a good, solid understanding of requirements fairly early, and in fact, sometimes you have to. If you're outsourcing something that you're not going to have a lot of opportunities for interaction with, you better do a pretty thorough job of thinking about requirements when you start sending out your RFPs. Other projects are more amenable to a more incremental or agile approach where you can build small chunks at a time, get feedback from those. You may or may not release them to customers, but at least you have the opportunity to make tangible progress by building something on a solid foundation of the first part of the requirements that you understand and that are high priority. So you need to have this judgment of when the requirements are good enough, and that's where we have to think about how much risk is there of proceeding with construction. How much risk is there of having to do things over because they weren't good enough? And one way to judge this is to have the victims of the requirements, the people who are going to have to do work based on them, review them to see if, from their point of view, they understand this body of requirements sufficiently well that they can, in fact, proceed with construction and whatever their part is, and feel like they're not going to have to throw it away and do it all over again. I think modeling is great, but let's focus our modeling activities on the parts of the system that are particularly complex or where the risk in the system is. Let's focus it on the parts we aren't sure about and use these other techniques to reach a deeper understanding instead of just writing down a few thoughts and hoping that's enough information. Sometimes people put a lot of effort into pinning down their user interface designs and putting that into the requirements. And I think that's part of the analysis paralysis problem. You'll notice it's called user interface design. In other words, it should be based on some understanding of the requirements of what users are going to need to accomplish and what the business is trying to accomplish. So I think if you put a lot of effort into detailing user interface designs before you feel like you can proceed with any construction activities, not only is that frustrating for people who think requirements takes too long anyway, but you might not have the right people even doing the user interface design. It's a different kind of activity from developing and understanding requirements. The next trap is the dreaded scope creep. Now, we should point out that change happens. Change is the reality, and it's certainly not always bad. And many times you come out ahead by dealing with change as opposed to just building what you thought you were supposed to build from the outset. But scope creep is not such a good thing. That's this insidious, relentless, rampant, uncontrolled growth of scope that doesn't ever seem to end and makes it difficult to not only have an idea of what you're going to have when you're done, but also have difficulty actually getting done. So one sign of that is that new requirements are continually added, but the schedule never changes. Nobody else comes along to work on it, and nothing is ever dropped or deferred. Everything is still top priority, and we just keep trying to stuff more and more things into the box until the box explodes. Another symptom is that we never agree on a clearly defined understanding of what the scope of our project is. And one clue about that is that proposed requirements, they come in and they seem like they fit, and then out they go again because someone says, no, we're not going to do that, and then here it is again. So it's like a whack-a-mole game trying to decide exactly what set of requirements really do fit in scope for our project. Maybe your requirements changes keep sneaking in through the back door. You might even have an official change process, but if it gets bypassed a lot, then all of a sudden things keep showing up that project managers and other key stakeholders never really anticipated. And that's going to make it awfully hard to manage that effectively and make sure that the most important things get done first, particularly if these requirement changes are not well communicated. You might find that during a requirements review, some of the issues that come up are whether a particular requirement even belongs in the product. Are we supposed to be doing this at all? So those kinds of scope issues should be resolved long before you get to the point of putting effort into detailing a particular requirement, only to discover that it really wasn't part of what you were trying to build in the first place. One more sign is that sign-off is just a game. It's just a ritual, and it doesn't really mean anything. And so we want to try to make a meaningful scope management process. And so I'm going to have several comments about change issues as we go along here. So here are some possible solutions if you think you're suffering or about to suffer from scope creep. First of all, figure out why. What are the root causes of the scope creep? Could be a lot of possible explanations. Maybe we didn't identify all the right users and they keep showing up, or maybe people are changing who they see as the market for our product, and so marketing keeps coming along with new features to try to make those new markets happy or whatever. But understand the root causes, because only then can you begin doing something about them. I like to begin projects by documenting some key things. We want to understand the business objectives. Why are we even working on this project? What are we hoping to tell from a business point of view will be better after this project is completed? And this will help you understand what I refer to as the product vision of what we're trying to build, and the project scope, which is the boundary between what's in and what's out as we move toward building that ultimate product vision, probably through a series of releases or iterations. This helps us understand our system boundaries and interfaces. We need to know where the system we're building or modifying fits into the universe, and that helps us understand scoping a little better. I think every project should put into place a change control process and follow it pretty darn religiously for all changes. I mean, that's what it's for. Now, you don't do this until you've actually baselined a set of requirements or other information. There's no point in following a formal change control process if you know the requirements are still volatile and undergoing evolution. But once you get to the point that we've agreed on a set of requirements, a baseline, then we have to get serious about dealing with change, because people have made commitments and have expectations. A lot of times, scope creep means we didn't do a very good job of actually trying to elicit requirements from all the right sources. So you might want to look at your BA capabilities, make sure they've got the information and training they need to ask the right questions of the right people. And let's follow a meaningful baselining process. If we have sign-off, and there's nothing wrong with sign-off, let's make sure all the participants know what it means. What are they saying with their signature? I've got some information about this in Chapter 2 of my book, Software Requirements, where I suggest some things that baselining might actually mean. And some people I know have actually written those statements right on the sign-off page, so that when someone is signing off on the page, we know exactly what the implications of that are. And then one of the implications that nobody likes is that when requirements change, we might have to renegotiate commitments. Change is a reality, but change is never free. And that means we need to understand the costs of making a change so we can make good business decisions as to which changes to incorporate. And this brings us nicely to trap number 5, an ineffective change process. And the obvious sign of that is that there isn't any change process. You know, if your organization has no mechanisms in place for dealing with change, then you're going to have a problem. If some people bypass the change process, as I mentioned, then you're going to have problems too. I was at a company once, and I was doing a process assessment. And one of the questions I asked of the group was, well, how does marketing make a change in your product if they want to change the requirements? Nobody said anything for a moment. And then one guy said, well, if marketing wants to make a change, they'll ask Bruce or Sandy, because Bruce and Sandy will always put it in, and the rest of us give them a hard time about changes. I didn't really think that was an ideal change process, so maybe we can do better than that. Another thing that happens is we get into a change that seems okay, and we discover that it's a lot bigger than we thought. So what's happening is maybe you're walking down the hall and one of your customers comes up and says, hey, I've got an idea for something we'd like to add to that system you're working on for us. And they describe your idea, and you say, yeah, it sounds okay, no problem, I can do that. So you go back to your office and you start thinking through this request. And the more layers of the onion you peel away, the bigger the onion gets. And you say, oh man, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, and it touches a lot more things, so I'm going to have to modify lots of work products. Plus, it turns out to be the exact opposite of this thing that somebody else agreed to do for another customer just last week, so what do we do? So the moral of the story is, let's not say sure, no problem, until we have some more information. Maybe what happens, and I've certainly seen this with some of my clients, is that all of a sudden new functionality became visible during system testing, and the testers weren't expecting it, and they really didn't know quite where that came from. That means stuff's getting into your system without going through reasonable sets of thought process and discussions with the right people. If we have problems keeping track of the status, of even knowing has a particular change request been accepted or rejected or what, then that means we don't have a very good change process. if it's not clear who makes the decisions, who are you going to call when you have an idea of something to change, and who makes the decision about it? If that's not obvious, then your change process is kind of weak. And related to this is not communicating changes to all of those people who are affected and perhaps have to change the work that they need to do because of a change request that was accepted. So some of these may explain some of the happenings in your business, and if that's the case, then here's some suggestions. First of all, define and then follow a practical change control process. Now, the point of this process is not to stifle change. The point is to anticipate the reality of change and provide mechanisms for accommodating that in our project so that you can have the right people consider the right set of change requests to make good business decisions as to which ones to accept, which ones to reject, and when to fold them into the sequence of work that's yet to be done. Now, if you ask people to follow a change process and they haven't done it before, they're going to see it as an obstacle. But I worked in the web development department of a very large company for a while, and the most useful thing we put into place was a change control process, which just helped them deal with the chaos that arose from this enormous unstructured backlog of and flood of change requests they got. So it's not a barrier, it's a structure. Now, regarding the people who have to make the decisions, that's called a change control board, or CCB. Now, anytime you say a change control board, people think, oh great, a committee that's going to slow everything down and make slow decisions and probably stupid decisions, so that's no good. Well, yeah, you can do that, but you don't have to. A change control board on some projects could be one person, if that person has the knowledge and authority to make binding change decisions. Normally, though, it's a diverse group that represents various functional areas that all have to be involved in understanding the implications and making those choices. Use a tool to help manage your changes so things are less likely to get lost. So we might start with an issue or problem tracking tool. Do not build one. There are plenty of commercial tools available. Some of the requirements management tools have those kinds of capabilities built in. And I think that's a really good way to help collect input, have a standard mechanism and set of data that you ask people to provide for each change request. This helps facilitate the communication by sending emails out to the people who need to know and so forth. But a tool is not a process, nor is it a substitute for a process. I was at a company once where I asked if they had a change control process, and somebody said, oh yes, we use Tracker, which was one of the commercial tools available at that time. So I asked, well, okay, does everybody know how to use Tracker? Do you all know what information goes into a change request and who receives that, and then how it gets communicated to people and how the impact is evaluated? We use Tracker, they said. So they had a tool, but they didn't have a process. It's also a good idea to put into place some policies and make it clear what kinds of changes need to go through this process, which ones could bypass it. That's fine. You can set up bypass mechanisms or quick mechanisms for certain sorts of emergency changes or something, but put policies in place so people know how we're going to do this effectively in our organization. And then it's very important to do some impact analysis on a change request before you say, sure, no problem, we can do that. Let's think through that. And my requirements book has got a bunch of checklists and stuff that you can use to help think through the possible implications of saying, sure, no problem. As you do accept change requests, let's compare those priorities against the remaining backlog of requirements. So this is one of the fundamental Agile characteristics, and it's something that certainly is applicable to all projects, to maintain a backlog of work yet to be done and to dynamically adjust those priorities to make sure the team is always delivering the maximum value to the customers in the minimum amount of time. Now, the last trap I want to say a little bit about today is a matter of having poor version control. Now, a lot of people are creating requirements in the traditional form of word processing documents. We've been doing that for generations, and many people will do that for a long time, yet to come. So this is very common. But documents have some limitations. And one of the problems we might run into is that people accept changes in the requirements, and yet those don't get folded back into our body of requirements. So you end up with several things. You end up with your initial software requirement specification in whatever form, whether it's a document or a bunch of cards or a database, whatever, you've got that. And then you've got this change process and a change tool that has some set of change requests, some of which have been approved, and then you have to sort of mentally merge those somehow and try to get a full picture of exactly what it is we're going to build. So that's kind of clumsy. Sometimes we have trouble distinguishing from versions of requirements, particularly in the form of printed documents. You might find that two people are looking at the requirement spec and they've got different identifiers. You know, maybe you've been in a meeting where there was a conversation like this. Somebody says, oh, I finally finished that multi-vendor catalog query function. That was really hard. And somebody else says, wait a minute, I thought they removed that a couple of weeks ago. And you look at it and say, no, right here on the top of page 5 of my requirement spec, it says build that catalog query function. And the other guy says, well, wait a minute, I don't have that on the top of page 5. What version have you got? And you say, well, I've got version 1.4. What version have you got? And he says, well, I've got version 1.4 also. So what you found is that you've got the same document version, but you have different contents. So nobody knows exactly what's going on. And you can have both problems. You can have different versions with the same ID. You can have identical documents that have different IDs. So basic version control. And this can happen both at a document set level, at a requirement set level, like in a document, and it can also happen at the individual requirements level. If requirements evolve over time, as they often do, somebody might be working from an older version of the requirement, you're working from a newer version of the requirement, and we're going to get confused. So there's a lot of possible ways we can go wrong on this. You know, you might end up implementing a feature that was canceled. You might end up with people testing against the wrong requirements. I saw this happen once at a contract development company. These guys were very good, and they were doing the testing for the latest drop of the system that they were building for a client. And they started getting, well, no, I'm sorry. They had sent the software over to the client, and the client was doing the system testing on it. And they thought the software was clean. It looked good to them, and these guys were a very, very good development team. But they started getting this flood of testing problem reports from the client on that particular release, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. Well, what they finally discovered was that the client's testers were testing the new version of the software with an obsolete version of the tests. So this is one of those very rare cases where what were being reported as bugs truly were features. You know, a little joke that we make, but in this case, that's what really happened. So this caused wasted time and money because not only did they have to diagnose the problem, but then they had to fix the tests, and then they had to retest it against the correct version of the requirements versus the software. So this is a very inefficient way to spend our time and money on a project. Another symptom of poor version control is that we lose historical versions, you know, the change history or earlier versions of the software, and sometimes you do want to go back to an earlier version for some reason. So some suggestions here to keep in mind. You might try some ways to merge requirements changes that are accepted right into the requirement set so that we have ideally a complete description of what we're trying to have when we do the next release. Adopt some kind of a versioning scheme. If you're doing documents, which is fine, although, as I mentioned, there are some limitations here. But if you're using documents, make sure you have a very clear and consistent version identification scheme. Things like using the date and timestamp, those aren't very reliable schemes. So there are various methods that you can use to make sure that when something that gets distributed changes, it has a modified version number so we can all tell that. Even better, put requirements documents under version control using the same kinds of tools as you might use for code management. So this gives some restrictions to read-write access and locking and allows certain people to make changes without overwriting other people's changes and makes the current versions available read-only to everybody. Now this is basically what I've been doing on another project just recently. I am very near the end of writing a third edition of my software requirements book, which will be published on August 22nd. And I'm working for the first time with a co-author, Joy Beatty of Sea Level. And Joy lives in Austin, Texas. I live in Portland, Oregon, although I'm going to Austin tomorrow so we can do some stuff together. But we've been going back and forth on this for some months now. This is a big book, a lot of new information in it. And we've been having to be very, very careful about version control as we work on various chapters in various states as you go from an idea up to having final pages ready to publish. So we've been using a SharePoint repository that Joy set up and using check-in and check-out discipline to avoid stepping on each other, and as long as you follow the rules, it's worked extremely well, and we've had very, very little experience with inadvertently losing anything. And we had previous versions we could go back to if we needed to, which we've certainly done from time to time. So do that with your requirements documents. Make sure you communicate the revisions to everyone who's affected by them. And the best approach is to use a requirements management tool. Again, something you don't want to build, something you want to buy. And the requirements management tools will do many good things for you, but in this particular sense, they will help you record a complete history of every change you've made in the requirements. And then basically a requirement specification is a report you generate from the database with a certain set of requirements based on selected criteria. So these kinds of really relatively simple solutions and practices, when they get incorporated into the culture and daily work of your organization, can go a long way towards solving a lot of these kinds of very common traps that people run into when they're trying to collaborate on software projects. So the reason we try to focus on these techniques is to avoid the unpleasant surprise factor that can happen at the end of so many software projects. My experience has been that surprises in software are almost never good news, and we'd like to try to avoid the unpleasant surprises. So hopefully you'll find some ways to use this list of symptoms to see if some of these traps are threatening your success, and use the list of solutions to see if there's some ways to sidestep the trap entirely or escape if you're already in there. So thanks very much. I'm going to now hand it over to Derwin Harris of Jama Software.
Thank you, Karl. Right now we're just transferring the screen over to myself, and my goal today is really just to provide a very quick demonstration of our product here at Jama Software. We call Jama, and I really want to highlight some of the key points that Karl brought up in this webinar around involving the stakeholders and tracking changes and versioning and all of those important. I won't be able to cover all of it in the time remaining, but I certainly want to leave time for questions and answers at the end. So I will keep this short. So to start, I'm really going to start at the point of a review. So you, as a business analyst or a project manager, has spent some time capturing the requirements, in this case a set of business requirements, and I'm in the product Jama, and we are looking at my reviews. I might be involved in multiple reviews, and in this case I have one active review called the business requirements, and you'll notice that it's in version 2, and this is important because as I drill into this review, you'll notice that it looks and acts a lot like a document, because the document structure makes sense. People are familiar with it, but where it lacks is it lacks that really ability to share and collaborate and to effectively pull in the stakeholders and involve them in this process. Some of the points that Karl made around making sure that the requirements aren't ambiguous, this is really facilitated and improved by involving stakeholders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a step back in time because I've actually gone through several iterations with this review. We've got a version 1 and a version 2. So Jama is actually helping manage that version control, and so that way you never lose those baselines that are essentially being created. So we're always able to go back and look at what did the requirements look like at that point in time. You'll also notice that I'm in here as both a moderator and an approver, and this is really intended to provide you the different views that people would see depending on the role that they're acting. I might be a moderator, I might be an approver, I might just be a reviewer who's simply there to participate and otherwise be involved. And this is obviously very important when we start talking about the different roles, such as a business analyst versus a customer versus a developer. You want their input early so that you're taking the time and the opportunity to ensure that everybody's on the same page. I know as a developer that I used to work on use cases that had been derived several layers from the requirements, and I had no visibility into the requirements. Had I been involved even remotely or had access to it, I would have been a much better developer. But what you'll see here is that we've enabled, or I've invited, the stakeholders or these key roles to participate in the conversation in a meaningful way. And the idea here is that they are able to communicate and collaborate on this information so that they can come to a consensus or come to a conclusion. And this is really improving the requirements, because I completely agree with Karl on the ambiguous words, and you want to write the requirements effectively, but the most important thing is, as he mentioned, that everybody's in agreement. And that is a mechanism for ensuring accurate requirements, is that you've involved folks and given them an opportunity to say, I don't think this is clear, or I don't understand what this means. And you want a lot of diversity in that process. And so if we kind of flip back to the current version and look at the different folks who are involved, now we've gone through several different iterations, but you can see here that I've actually invited quite a few folks. And this is very different from maybe using a document-centric, where you're not encouraged to send that document out to a lot of people. Whereas here, because it's really happening inside of a single environment, you're really empowered to be able to do that. And so this is really helping you as a product manager or a business analyst or as a team to come to an agreement with those requirements. Now, if I take a step back and we look at how this is playing inside of the project, so this is my project, and it's a much more complex world. You know, the beautiful thing about a review is that I'm able to take a snapshot. In this case, I was able to take these business requirements that I've organized and worked on, and I've been able to send them for that review. I've been able to pull the right people in. But along the way, this is the beginning, or this is maybe the middle, but throughout the process, we want to be able to conduct this review, but you also want to begin connecting this information to the other artifacts within your project, whether you've got use cases, functional requirements, or stories. And this connection is really helping the team stay in alignment so that you're ensuring throughout the entire process that you're not losing information. And this is also another point that Karl made, is this idea of an impact analysis, the ability to look at the business requirement, or really at any level, and to quickly understand the full breadth of that impact, that this business requirement has 2 use cases and multiple functional requirements, maybe even the test cases and defects associated with it. And you can look at this from any level. And so this is sort of going back to that reference of me as a developer. If I was working on a story or a use case, I could immediately see where I fit in the big picture. And that's incredibly powerful from enabling teams to be more efficient and to be in more alignment. You can also look at this view, and again, I'm sort of flying through some of these things, but I just want to demonstrate a lot of the different functionality and a lot of the alignment with these common traps that Karl's talking about. This is a coverage explorer, which is really just enabling me to look holistically across the entire project and understand where we are from a coverage standpoint. Have we missed any requirements? And you can see down below here that there are in fact some requirements that we don't yet have fully defined out all the way to the test cases. And so that's an incredibly important insight to be able to get out of a system very quickly. And so last but not least, and just sort of to wrap this up, there's oftentimes, you know, what I've really talked about thus far is this more formal process of reviews. We've talked about traceability, but oftentimes decisions are being made ongoing and in the moment. And so this is something that's quite powerful within Jama, is this ability that no matter where I'm at in the system, I might be on an individual item, I have the ability to quickly reach out to anybody on the team, right? Christy Wolf or maybe Kevin Pepper, and I want to mention them, and what I really want is I want her to make a decision on something. I need a decision, or I have a question for Christy Wolf. And so I'm going to enter this into the system immediately where I'm at in the native environment. And this is important because we're really attempting to remove barriers from people communicating and collaborating so that information doesn't go unknown or is not seen by other individuals until it's too late. You know, we really want to encourage folks to reach out and get the decision and get the answer that they need in a timely and effective manner. And like I said, this is something that can happen at the individual item. It can happen at the project level or at the release level. So here's all the comments that are taking place. I can quickly filter to just say, you know, I just want to know all the decisions that are currently pending for me, and it's going to bring those up, and that way I can work through this list in an effective manner. So this is quite powerful. And because we recognize that users they're very mobile today, they can be anywhere, they might be in a meeting, they might be off-site, and so we really want to encourage the fact that this kind of collaboration, this kind of conversations can actually take place inside of any environment. Whether it's an email that you received, you can reply directly to it, but here I'm able to visualize, see the description of the information, and based on this I can look at the conversation and respond effectively. So all of this is tied to this notion that the stakeholders and the people involved are critical to the success of your project. And really that's all I wanted to show today. This is really a teaser to just give you an overview of what Jama does. I highly encourage you to go to our website, jamasoftware.com. We offer a trial. You can play around with it, contact our sales folks, and we'd love to walk you through it and show you how it can help you.
Thanks, Derwin and Karl. You both have shared some really valuable information today, and you know, we have some great questions that have come in. So let's see how many we can get through in the time that we have remaining. So for all of you attendees out there, please feel free to submit a question in the questions section of the control panel, and we will do our best to get through as many as possible during this session. So let's kick it off with the first question. How do we address situations where businesses business is so used to developers speaking for them that business is no longer confident to give their requirements without asking the developers first?
Well, I can comment on that. First of all, I think the key word that's missing from the question is the idea of collaboration. We have to try to, here it says, you know, the business is not confident to give their requirements without asking the developers. Well, let's have that conversation. Let's have various stakeholders participate, but let's also understand who our decision makers are. I don't think in most cases developers should be making decisions about what functionality to include because they simply aren't knowledgeable enough about the business objectives for the project in most cases and for the various user needs that have been expressed. So this would suggest to me if you know, business is so used to developers speaking for them that they sort of ask developers about it, well, that suggests a dysfunctional relationship perhaps where maybe we haven't done a good job of making it clear you know, who our decision makers are and whether needs or development preferences are driving it. So I would look for a very collaborative approach and start trying to steer the culture toward a direction where we start by understanding who those decision makers are, and I think that will probably help.
Great, thank you, Karl. Here's another one for you as well. We struggle in that our business operations team writes requirements, and they typically write functional requirements instead of business requirements, and push back saying that anything that the, quote, business requires is a business requirement. Do either of you have any ideas around how to help manage this process?
Yeah, maybe I can start that first, and maybe Derwin has something to add as well. But I think what that question is getting at is a fundamental problem with our business, which is terminology. We do not have universally agreed upon definitions of different kinds of requirements information, and consequently, you know, some person might very well think that, oh, this is a business requirement, and somebody else might call that same piece of information a software requirement, system requirement, functional requirement, user requirement, feature, constraint, you know, lots of different terminology that's used. So what you have to do in the organization is adopt some common terminology with adjectives in front of the word requirements. So I use the terms, and I describe all these in my book, which is titled Software Requirements. That's the one I've got the 3rd edition coming out with. And the definitions that I use are, I think, really clear there, where a business requirement is really talking about your business objectives. It's the requirement of the business, which then turn into or lead to an understanding of user requirements, which describe things users will be able to do with the product, which then leads to an understanding of functional requirements, which describes things developers build. Developers do not implement business requirements in this particular model of terminology. They implement functionality, which allows users to do certain things which should align with achieving the business objectives. So the first thing you have to do is get some common vocabulary so that you don't end up having fistfights over things when maybe you're actually in agreement but using different words for it.
Great, thanks, Karl. Derwin, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate the fact. It's funny, I was going to reference your book, Karl, but yeah, I was just on a customer site the other day, and that was a topic of quite a lengthy discussion. Is that they're really trying to fundamentally figure out their process, and that alone is important to sort of come up with that terminology, come up and make sure that everybody involved in that process is in agreement with what that process is. And so whether you're looking at a tool and the process in conjunction with each other, neither one replaces or subsedes the other, but it is important that everybody's in alignment with what it is the definition of the terms do. And I think that Karl's book does call that out, that really it's more important that everybody agrees with those terms and the purpose of those terms than it is just to simply have those terms in existence.
Thanks, Derwin. And in fact, speaking of Karl's book, Karl, would you mind sharing the name of the book that you did reference during this session as well? We've received a couple of questions around what the name is.
Oh, of course, I would be delighted to share that information.
I knew that.
It's simply called Software Requirements. Okay? Software Requirements is the title. If you go to Amazon or O'Reilly.com, it's published by Microsoft Press, and the current version is the 2nd edition, and the 3rd edition is available now for pre-order at Barnes & Noble and Amazon and O'Reilly. O'Reilly distributes Microsoft Press books, which is why that's the site that's involved. And the 3rd edition will be published, along with my co-author, Joy Beatty, and I will be published on August 22nd. And we'll be glad when it is, because this is a lot of work.
Thank you, Karl. So let's see if we can fit in a couple more questions in the last couple of minutes we do have. There's an interesting one that came in around change management. How do you control the change at a model? For example, a domain model. Which is the granularity you recommend? The class level?
I don't think you can generalize. I mean, suppose you've got a model, and the only change you made was in a flow or a message from one object to another. Well, if that's a critical piece of information, then that has to be recorded and communicated. So I don't think you can make a blanket statement about what level of granularity. But ideally, in fact, also usually when you are modifying a model, just like when you're modifying a document, you tend to make multiple changes at once. You don't necessarily just create a version, change one sentence, that's a new version, create another, change another sentence, that's a new version, change one line in a diagram, that's a new version. You generally are going to make a set of changes at once. So basically the rule of thumb that I would use is that any version of a deliverable that's going to be distributed beyond an individual person. In other words, if you're going to be taking what you created and send it to other people to see and use and work with, then that should have a unique version identifier, and you should retain the history of the ones that came before. But I don't know how to advise a specific level of granularity for a particular type of object, because you could make a trivial change in the name of one symbol that isn't meaningful, or you could make a very powerful, important, far-reaching change, but didn't have to type any more characters than that.
Great, thank you, Karl. And looking at our time, I think we're running a little bit short here. So I do want to thank everyone for participating. At this point, I'm going to pass this back over to our moderator, Ben. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Thanks, Karl. Thanks, Derwin, for a very informative presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. And we wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event, so we hope you have a great day.